Hey guys, Languages Lover here and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Lingo Mastery, a method that could honestly use some improvements. So, yeah, let's get right into it, but before we get started, I want to remind you guys to leave a like on the video and hit the subscribe button and also turn on notifications to be notified whenever I upload a new video. So for starters, Lingo Mastery.
Cool name for a company, eh?
That's also really ironic. If you guys want to know the irony behind this name, you will sadly have to wait till the very end of the video, where I will be explaining why this name makes absolutely no sense based on the approach that they're offering. And I also wanted to point out that I will be specifically covering the phrasebook series, because Lingo Mastery also has other series, such as conversational dialogues, words and context, and short stories. However, these won't be covered in too much detail here, with the exception of short stories, because I do have one in this series. But my main analysis will be on the phrasebook series, and I believe I have all of the phrasebooks in this collection, with the exception of French, because French is my mother tongue, so I don't need to get the phrasebook for it, and Tagalog, which I'm not learning at the moment. But I do believe these have the same strengths and weaknesses as the other ones in this series, which I have right next to me. So we're actually gonna go one by one and see what the strengths and weaknesses are for each one. So, for starters, we're actually going to start with the short stories series. Now, the only one I have for this series is the Swedish one. And these ones, based on my first impressions, are actually pretty decent.
Eventually.
So basically, each chapter is structured that way. The only parts in English are chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and all that kind of stuff. The rest is in Swedish, or in your target language, depending on what it is. You do have your title in Swedish. You have the story with some words in bold. Each chapter is like 3 to 4 pages long. And then you do have a summary of the story right here. You do have it in Swedish. And then you have it in English, just to be sure that you understood the main idea of the story. Then you have a vocabulary table with all the words that were in bold in the lesson, with their meaning in English, so that's pretty good. And to wrap things up, you also have questions about the story. You basically have, I believe, 5 questions per chapter.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Yeah, most of the time. So you do have it, and you also have the answers next to it. So these are actually pretty good. I have nothing bad to say about these. They aren't really structured on grammar nor pronunciation. It's probably the main flaw that I can say about these, but overall, it is really good. I would probably rate these like a solid 8.5 out of 10, I would say. Good job. And yeah, now it's time to talk about the phrasebook series. We're going to start with the Spanish one. As I said, for each language, I'm going to give the positives and then move on to the negatives. So for starter, there is one positive thing I can say about all of these, however. The cover is really, really gorgeous. Huge thumbs up to whoever designed this and all the other ones. Now for the 2 positives I noticed while reading this. First of all, they give you access to a bonus class. And I will actually show you what that is in a few seconds.
A few moments later.
So yeah, they actually give you access to a 5-day masterclass, where they can talk about some stuff they did not mention in the book. So I guess there is that. And another good thing I noticed is that they do cover pronunciation, like quite a lot. They do talk about vowels, vowel combinations, like K, I,
Later.
and yeah, that's about where the good parts end. And my first flaw, or the first weird thing I noticed, is that, take a look at this introduction. If you have finally decided to visit one of the most beautiful countries in the world. One of. And what is that country? Well, if you look at the front cover, it's obviously Spain, right? But here's the thing about Castilian Spanish is that words actually pronounced differently. For example, the main one being the C word. Here, that's no problem. But the C with an E and an I is actually pronounced th in Spain. And it's S in Latin America. And over here, they actually show you the pronunciation based on Latin American Spanish. I know it's not a big deal, but still something I noticed, and it's kind of weird. They're talking about Spain in the introduction, and then they're like, oh, fuck, you know that? Screw that. We're actually going to teach you Latin American Spanish pronunciation. I don't mind, but that's just weird. And another thing I noticed is that they don't really cover grammar. And it's basically the same for all of these. You do have your phrases, and once you get into the phrases, that's it. You learn phrases and there's nothing else. Yeah, see? No grammar, no insight. Yeah, nothing. You just learn phrases and that's it. So this phrase book does not have a grammar section. And I know Spanish does not have the most complicated grammar out of all languages. But there's one essential thing that they should have mentioned, and that is that in Spanish you can actually omit pronouns. And it is even preferable to do so. Now they do that in the sentences. Like for example, we just find one. Okay, sometimes they do not follow this rule. But sometimes...
Just then.
Yeah, there you go. I'm not paying for that. No voy a pagar por eso. They don't say yo no voy a pagar por eso. They do use the common rule. No voy a pagar por eso. So they should have really at least mentioned that in Spanish you can actually omit pronouns because the ending indicates who's doing the action. And yeah, they should have really covered grammar in more detail because... Yeah, I know the word order is the same as in English, but someone who's just starting learning the language has no idea about that, you know? They don't even show conjugation rules like yo como, comes, come, comemos, and all that kind of stuff. They don't talk about future, nor past, nor subjunctive. I know subjunctive is more advanced, but they do have some sentences in here that actually use a subjunctive. So they could have actually mentioned that, but they don't. So yeah. But... as far as sentences go, they all look correct. But yeah, these are my main complaints. Because once you get... Yeah, like I said, once you get into the sentences, you only learn sentences. You don't have any insight. And that's it. So yeah, there's that. So that's the Spanish one. And you will see that the two next ones actually have something in common with the Spanish one. Let's move on to the second one, which is Portuguese. So basically, just like the Spanish one, amazing front cover, and it's the same number of words, 1,500 common phrases and expressions. And the first positive I will say is that it does also cover the pronunciation, as well as letter combinations and nasal sounds and consonants.
10 seconds later.
So, and it also gives some cool cultural insights. Yeah, right here. They do talk about the different Brazilian accents for that. And they also address the formal language. Yeah, they address the formal language, like for example, the difference between o senhor and a senhora and você in Brazil. And você daqui, o senhor é daqui, and all that kind of stuff. And they also talk about the general rule when it comes to noun genders, like feminine usually ends in A and masculine usually ends in O. And as for my flaws, well, the first one, just like for the Spanish one, is not a major flaw, but it's Brazilian Portuguese. So if you want to learn European Portuguese, then don't get this. Even though some phrases are similar and all that kind of stuff, it is still Brazilian Portuguese, and the pronunciation is not the same as the one from Portugal, so it may be less useful for you. And there is also no mention that you can omit pronouns, so that kind of sucks. And the last flaw I noticed for the Portuguese one is that they don't teach verb endings, because just like for the Spanish one, once you start learning sentences, you're only learning sentences. No grammar, no notes saying, hey, notice anything different? Well, that's because blah, blah, blah. There's nothing like that. Doesn't teach verb endings, doesn't teach future, past, subjunctive, anything like that, nor sentence structure for that matter. Just, you learn sentences, and you'll notice patterns when you get there.
That's kind of sad.
But, yeah, what do you want to do? So that's the Portuguese one. And the next one is another Romance language, and the last one in the series, if you don't count the French one, and that's the Italian phrase book. So, I actually noticed less flaws and less goods for this one, because it's mostly similar. But the first one I noticed is that, well, the first good I noticed is that it does talk about, well, pronunciation. Just like the other ones, they all cover pronunciation, basically. And it also talks about consonants, And it also talks about stress. That's the other one. So that's for that. And just like the other ones, when you start learning sentences, you learn sentences or words. No grammar whatsoever. And no mention that in Italian you can also omit pronouns. You can say mangio una pizza instead of io mangio una pizza. And no verb conjugation. It is not covered here. Sorry. So yeah, another flaw. So that's for the Romance languages. Now we're going to talk about the Germanic languages. The first one I have is the Dutch one. So this one is actually pretty straightforward. I haven't noticed a whole lot of flaws for this one either. But the first thing is that they do talk about pronunciation, as all of them do.
You get the idea.
You also talk about diphthongs, so letter combinations, and they talk about dialects. So for example, Flemish, which is the Dutch spoken in Belgium, Basic Dutch, and Limburgish. So yeah, that's a cool note right there.
Later.
And something I haven't noticed, well, I haven't mentioned, is that they all follow the exact same structure. Like they all have introduction, colors, numbers, greetings, date and time, common questions, and so on and so forth. So you can actually learn the same sentences in all of these languages. I think they do have some differences, but they're only minor differences, and most sentences are actually the same across all of these. And I haven't said it for Italian, but yeah, cover looks nice, same for Dutch.
Later that night.
But yeah, they don't talk about grammar, no verb endings, or sentence structure. Yeah, the Dutch sentence structure is not the hardest one in the world, but it's still something. It's really similar to the German sentence structure, and it is not the same as in English. So there's that. So yeah, they should have really delved into sentence structure. This is the first one that I have to complain about sentence structure, because it is important. You do need to know the sentence structure when you learn a language. If you don't include it, then people are just gonna be mixed up. So yeah. The next one is the Swedish one. So Swedish is the only one for which I have a short story phrasebook and the phrasebook itself. Now this one is a little bit different because I didn't really notice any flaw right off the bat, because this one actually includes, well, a pronunciation part
Soon after.
as well as a grammar one. Yeah, combination of letters. This is also good because some people do get mixed up with this pronunciation, like hu, huta, and huerna.
Moments later.
An introduction to Swedish grammar, and it's really the essential of Swedish grammar. They do say, okay, it's really similar to English and does have the same sentence structure as English. I do like that. Then they talk about verbs, which is really, really simple in Swedish. Jag tror, du tror, hon, han, tror, vi tror, and all these other ones. It is really simple, so they just cover present, past, suspine, and past participle. Then they talk about nouns and adjectives and en and et. Then they talk about plurals, ar, en, or, er. And they also talk about that dreaded rule that I hate in Swedish, where you have to put the n after the word.
Later.
But yeah, this one actually talks about grammar. And I don't understand why the other ones couldn't do that. But yeah, they did with the Swedish one. And yeah, the rest is exactly the same. And just like the other ones, it follows a really similar structure when it comes to stuff you're actually going to learn. So yeah, that's the Swedish one. I'm sorry I could not find any single flaw for this one. Maybe there is. If there is, then I can actually let you know in the comments. But so far, I just couldn't think of anything. Because the other ones clearly had flaws. And this one, I'm like, is there really a flaw? It covers the essential, so there's that. Alright, and the last Germanic language, you obviously already know what it is, but in case you didn't know, it's German. There you go. So, just like for the other ones, this one has a lot more flaws than I noticed, actually. Because German is a harder language to learn than Dutch and Swedish. Yeah, you do talk about pronunciation,
10 seconds later.
diphthongs, and all these. And you also talk about some stuff related to grammar, but it's not really a lot. Like for example, over here you talk about dialects, like Hochdeutsch and Swiss Deutsch and all these. So there's that. Another good aspect is that they talk about the difference between du and sie, which is the formal and informal. And that's pretty much where my good things end. Now for the flaws. This book doesn't talk about cases, and that is a really beginner thing to know in German, that German has cases. A word actually has a different ending when it comes with a different case. And they also don't mention that several prepositions can introduce a specific case, like for example, für for the accusative and zu for the dative. And they also completely ignore sentence structure.
Later.
The sentences they offer actually have the correct sentence structure, like, will I be able to breastfeed? Werde ich stillen können? Yeah, that's the correct sentence structure, but they do not mention it. They do not mention it whatsoever. And that's a major flaw, because German does not have the same sentence structure as English. The last flaw I noticed is that they don't really talk about word and adjective declension, like ein gutes Buch, mein guter Freund, and all of these. And that word endings actually change depending on the case. But yeah, they don't talk about cases whatsoever. So...
One long angry line later.
But yeah, just like the other ones, the cover looks nice. Does have 1,500 common sentences. Here's a spine in the back, but... This is hands down one of my least favorite. If I were a beginner, this would be one of my least favorites because, yeah, German is so hard to begin with. That would be like, okay, what am I doing here? But yeah, it's extremely hard because they don't give any indication whatsoever. That, okay, the second verb comes at the end. Oh, when you have a direct object, it's the accusative, and you do this and you do that, but they don't. They really don't. So I don't think I can recommend it, which is sad. Really sad, because the other part, well, the sentences are actually really good, but they should have really detailed grammar in more detail. There are some stuff way more important in German than the difference between du and sie. I mean, I guess it's important, but there are way more important aspects, like the cases and the sentence structure. This is just unforgivable. I'm sorry, but yeah, that's for that. So, that's the German one.
Much later.
Alright, now we move on to the only Slavic language that this collection has, and that is Russian. So, yeah, Russian has several problems. But for starters, let's start with the goods. They do talk about the alphabet. Okay, what letter is similar to English and has the same sound?
Later that same evening.
So yeah, they show you the alphabet. You have voiceless and voiced consonants.
Later.
So now, well, to be fair, they do talk about grammar. They mention that there is a difference between masculine and feminine in the verbs. Let me just find it. Hold on. Okay, yeah, right here, you see, they do mention that there is a difference between я бы хотел and я бы хотела. One is masculine and the other is feminine. Another positive is that they talk about the difference between ты and вы, the informal and the formal. Then they talk about the verb to be, which is weird in Russian because it isn't really mentioned. You can basically omit the verb to be, like I am Mark, which is my real name. Я Mark. Don't say I am Mark. Say me or I Mark, basically. And they also briefly talk about adjective declension. Yeah, it's really minor. And yeah, I guess they also mention the fact that there is no articles in Russian. But yeah, that's pretty much where the positives end. Yeah, time to put your knowledge into practice. We will not teach you the grammar and you'll be like, okay, have fun. Yeah. So now for my negatives. Just like for German, they don't talk about cases. Russian has an even bigger problem because it actually has more cases than German, so you need to know them. And this is a beginner's book, and I believe it is a beginner thing to start noticing the cases bit by bit. But they don't talk about cases. And they also don't talk about sentence structure, nor do they mention that sentence structure is actually really flexible in Russian because of the case endings. But yeah, they don't talk about cases, so yeah. And they also don't teach you basic verb conjugations.
12 seconds later.
They also don't mention that several prepositions introduce specific endings or cases, like k for the dative. But yeah, just like for the German one, I don't think I can recommend it. If you want to buy this, then go for it, but learn the grammar on your own beforehand. Probably buy another book just to learn the grammar, and then buy it if you want it. But you obviously need to have more books than this because it's just not enough. I'm sorry. Alright, so now the final two languages. The first one is Chinese or Mandarin. Love that cover, by the way. The only good thing I noticed is that, well, apart from the fact that the sentences are pretty good, is the fact that they actually talk about the tones. And yeah, I actually looked at these on the same day and I was like, oh, I'm not really a fan. And I hadn't looked at the Chinese one yet, and I was like, okay, don't tell me they're gonna omit the tones, because that's like the core essence of Mandarin, right? It's a tonal language, and you need the tones. But they do talk about the tones, so I'm sorry for being harsh on you, Lingo Mastery. You did not disappoint in that regard. But with that said, there are several flaws. They do not reassure people about the simplicity of verb conjugation. Like, Mandarin has no verb conjugation that I'm aware of. It's past, present, future is all the same. Sure, like for the verb to be. It's all the same. So they don't reassure people. And they don't even mention that, okay, in order to indicate the past, it's like you just need a time marker, basically. Like, yesterday I eat. It's not yesterday I ate, but it's yesterday I eat. Tomorrow I eat. Today I eat. Yeah. So conjugation is really simple in Mandarin, so it's not what makes it one of the hardest languages to learn. And they don't also mention the importance of ma in the spoken language. If you know Mandarin, you do know that ma, which is shown right here, is actually really basic. It indicates a question, and you have to say the word ma most of the time when you're asking a question. But they don't talk about that. They do not talk about ma. And going back to the tones,
One eternity later.
they do talk about the tones, but they don't really explain why it's important to differentiate the tones. Like, okay, they explain you how to pronounce each one, and that's good. But they don't mention that it is really important to learn tones because a word can have many tones. And if you mispronounce a word, it can change the meaning of a sentence. Like, for example, people need to know that there's a difference between ma, and ma in spoken Mandarin. So if you mispronounce a tone, a word can have a completely different meaning. So please learn your tones.
2 very boring minutes later.
I guess another flaw would probably be that they don't really talk about the written language, but I cannot blame them actually, because Chinese has so many characters that they cannot fit all of them in a single book. And I guess, yeah, they do talk about pinyin, but it's not really going to help you learn the language. Just to tell you, hey, there's a Latin version of Chinese and it's called pinyin. That's it. But yeah, I guess I cannot really blame them for not teaching you the written language, because it is a really big doozy, and yeah, it's really hard to learn the Chinese alphabet. So I cannot blame them for that. So that's for that. Alright, now my last one, my last victim of the day, if you want to call it that way, is Japanese. Also nice cover.
Later.
So let's talk about the goods. They actually talk about the written language this time. And they do mention the 3 different alphabets and what they're used for. So it is really good. And the sentences over here include both the written language and the pronunciation underneath. So that's pretty good. They also mention politeness levels, but it is really minor. They don't really go that much into detail. Like, I can give you guys... Oh, they also... Yeah, I'm going to talk about that later. Yeah, final thoughts. They do mention politeness levels, but their excuse for not going into further details is that Japanese people also have a hard time with politeness levels. Do they? I don't know. I'm not Japanese, but I guess that's an excuse. And my next one is that they actually talk about long vowels and silent vowels. And they also, well, I will give them props. It is really important to mention that in the beginner's phrasebook, because there are some differences between words with short vowels and long vowels. Like, for example, Obasan, which is aunt, and Obaasan, which is grandmother. So, yeah, good job for including that. And that's pretty much where my goods end. Now let's talk about the flaws. You may have noticed that right here. They talk about the scripts. Final thoughts. Here are your phrases. So once more, no grammar section. So they don't talk about sentence structure, which, just like German, is actually really important to cover, because Japanese is an SOV language and not an SVO language. So when you're not aware of that, you're not able to do your own sentences. No mention of the word ka in spoken Japanese, just like there is no explanation for ma in Chinese. Like as you can see here, the word ka is really important in Japanese. It's has basically the same function as ma. It indicates a question, and you see that word everywhere, but they don't even talk about it. Please do. It is really important. And my final criticism is that they do not talk about particles. You know, like wa, ni, o, and all these other particles. I mean, these are everywhere in Japanese. Just like phrasal verbs in English, they're everywhere. Particles are everywhere in Japanese. These sentences include particles, but there is no mention of them in the book, that Japanese also uses particles. You see these words, but you have no idea what they represent. So yeah, but I digress. So here's my review, and with all that being said, I believe this is a perfect moment to go back to the irony I mentioned at the very beginning. The name Lingo Mastery, to me, at least, implies that you will master a language. Now, obviously, no single book is going to allow you to master a language, but in order to master a language, you actually need to be aware of its grammar, right? And if you don't know how the language works grammatically, then you cannot formulate your own sentences and recognize patterns. In these books, Lingo Mastery actually assumes that you don't really need to learn the grammar, and they're like,
Oh, well, you know, you'll figure it out the more you learn phrases in the book, and you don't need to worry about grammar. You'll start recognizing patterns on your own.
well, that to me is just a load of nonsense. It may work for some people, but my main goal for this review was actually to put myself in the head of someone who had never studied any of these languages and had no idea how the grammar worked and was looking for ways to learn them. And I can actually tell you right now that if these books were the only books on the market, I would just tell you to ignore them entirely and only use apps or audio courses. Now, these books are fine for someone who already knows how the grammar works for each of these languages, like myself. But if you're just starting to learn the language and you're looking for better options, then please, by all means, consider getting yourself a Lonely Planet phrasebook. They put as much emphasis on pronunciation as they do on grammar, whereas Lingo Mastery prioritizes pronunciation and barely deals with grammar. So, with all that said, it's time for my rating. I think I will rate this series a solid 6 out of 10. It's still passable, but it has some good aspects, but some books are clearly better than others in this series. Some do have a grammar section, whereas some others do not. And some grammar sections are actually better than others. So, yeah, I really wish they would have put the same amount of effort into each book instead of some random books in this series. So, no, you cannot master a language if you know nothing about grammar. And that is why Lingo Mastery is just a load of nonsense to me. The short stories series is good. The phrasebook one, not so much. And yeah, the name may be good for sales, but once people know what hides behind their products, this can cause some serious outrage. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video despite all the rant. This is something I really had to let you know because once I found out about this, I was so outraged and I really had to make a video about it. But yeah, that's the video. But if you did enjoy, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, and that will really help a lot, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!